Morning people, welcome back to F Politics. So, Owen Jones, probably the most well-known, relatively young journalist in the UK, has quit the Labour Party and he's also pushing people away from voting for Labour. On the whole, and we'll get to that. So, is he right and should we all join him in abandoning Labour at the next election? I should probably start by saying I don't like Owen Jones, and yet I'm about to agree with 90% of what he said today. Whenever anybody asks me what I think of Owen Jones, I always say he's great at what he does, he should be listened to on almost every issue, but never trusted. And I can explain why at the end, but for now, let's get into what he said.
I've always been a Labour guy, but for me, the party's over, and I've just quit. And now I think it's time for us to vote Green or Independent, unless you've still got a Labour MP who offers an actual alternative to the catastrophic Tory policies which have brought this country to the edge of ruin.
Now there's a lot to say about that, because for starters, Owen Jones is getting a lot of criticism for this because there'll be lots of constituencies, places around the country, where the Labour Party candidate is the only candidate with a real shot of beating the Tory. And so if people there take Owen Jones's advice and don't vote Labour, they risk letting a Tory back into Parliament. But his argument against that is this:
the Tories are toast. You can send Labour a message without risking them sneaking back in.
Now, obviously, nobody knows how everybody else in the country is going to vote at the next election, so it is obviously a risk that by not voting for the candidate best placed to beat the Tories in your area, you risk letting the Tories back into Parliament. But Owen Jones is arguing that it's worth that risk to send Labour a message that they've moved too far to the right and they no longer represent the progressive values that a Labour Party is supposed to uphold. Now, my position on this has very much evolved over time. In 2019, after the election, I realised that the only way you save the country is if we get a voting system where every vote counts equally. And I took a hard line on that I would not support voting for Labour unless they were firmly committed to giving us proportional representation. Because I just witnessed Boris Johnson get a whopping majority at the election to get Brexit done, even though the majority of votes had gone to parties that were offering a second referendum. And I did the maths and found that if you compare the number of seats that each party got in Parliament to the number of votes that they got, Tory votes were 30% more than Labour votes and 20 times more than Green votes. So how do you solve the climate crisis if Tory votes were 20 times more than Green votes? Every progressive cause is being damaged by our first-past-the-post voting system. And if Labour manages to win under this unfair system, they're even less likely to support changing it. So I took the same position that you see presidents take in action movies. I don't negotiate with terrorists, because it just encourages them to keep doing the wrong thing. So I do understand the position of not voting Labour if they're still doing the wrong things. And arguably, our first-past-the-post voting system is the most right-wing policy in the UK, because if you look at all the elections since World War II, the majority of votes have always gone to parties to the left of the Tories, and yet the Tories have been in power for 47 of the last 77 years. So supporting first past the post consistently gives us governments that are more right-wing than the actual people. But after how the Tories have managed the pandemic, Partygate, Liz Truss, the disaster of Brexit, all the corruption, the cost of living crisis, they've fallen so far in the polls that keeping Labour out of government simply wasn't a viable option. And on top of that, the Labour Party's members have voted overwhelmingly to change the voting system to one where all votes count equally. So even if Keir Starmer does become Prime Minister and still wants to be a dick, he'll be answering to party members who overwhelmingly share our values. Which brings us to where we are now, where many people are saying, look, the priority is to get the Tories out. We can work with Labour after the election to get them to do the right things, but for now, hold your nose, vote tactically, and for many of you, that will mean voting Labour. And many other people are saying, no, we cannot vote for Labour, they've gone way too far to the right, what they've done over Israel and Gaza is utterly historically shameful. And so my view is, we don't need to fight over this. As I said, nobody knows how everybody's going to vote, and whether or not it'll be necessary to vote tactically or not. Because let's be blunt, my ideal scenario is not a huge majority for the Labour Party, because Owen Jones is right about this.
They're just after a big majority, so they've got absolute power and they can do anything they want and no one can stop them. You can't trust them with that power.
Our best shot of getting the change in this country that we actually need is a hung parliament, where no party has an overall majority and Labour has to work with the other parties like the Greens, the Lib Dems, the SNP and some independents in order to get anything done. So for me, the most important thing is just make sure that you and everybody you know actually votes. Look at tactical voting sites like stopthetories.vote so that you know what the tactical choice is to get the Tories out. Some of you will vote tactically to make sure you keep the Tories out, and some of you won't. And if that means more seats for the Greens, I'm so totally cool with that. We don't need to be at each other's throats, because we're all going to need to work together after the election. Which is why, once again, despite my history with Owen Jones, I'm agreeing with him. Just like when after he finally came on board with opposing Brexit, I put the past aside and stood shoulder to shoulder with the guy. And let's go back to my favourite thing in his video.
To vote Green or Independent, unless you've still got a Labour MP who offers an actual alternative to the catastrophic Tory policies which have brought this country to the edge of ruin.
Because he's not saying don't vote Labour at all, because he's telling you that there are Labour candidates and MPs that you should be voting for, and he includes Clive Lewis among them, Labour's biggest spokesperson for a fair voting system. And I really appreciate that inclusion. It builds functional trust. And one final thing that he's definitely right about:
if we don't get our act together, when it all ends in tears for Starmer's Labour and when they're in government, believe me, it will. The far right will be waiting in the wings instead.
And we can see examples of that with the high risk that Trump gets re-elected because Biden is losing some youth vote with his stance on Israel. We can see it in France with the rise of Marine Le Pen. And if Keir Starmer doesn't actually improve people's quality of life, Nigel Farage is just waiting there for the Tories and Labour to be destroyed so he can just walk straight in. Now, I know I said I'd explain why I can never trust Owen Jones, and I really don't want to because I know we all need to work together, but I know you're going to ask, so here we go. Owen Jones is a smart guy. He knows what the right thing is to do, and he does it almost all the time except when it doesn't suit his agenda. Which is why when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, somebody who'd campaigned against our membership of the EU for his entire career, Owen Jones was also in favour of leaving the EU. He wrote an article at the end of 2015 arguing that the left should support leaving the EU. Now, while yes, he campaigned against Brexit during the referendum, afterwards his position was this.
So you're probably listening to all of this and thinking, well, why aren't I calling for a second referendum? And I'm not going to do that. We've got to get the best possible Brexit. However bad this situation is, we've got to make the best of it we can. That can't happen under the Tories, but that's why I don't think, despite my grievances, there should be a second referendum.
And I had a go at him for that, saying that he may be able to afford to just make the best of Brexit, but most people can't. And he knew it would make people poorer, because at the time he was tweeting that leaving the EU single market and customs union would damage the economy. And he also knew that staying in the EU single market and customs union would do the exact opposite of the taking back control that Brexit voters wanted. So he knew that there was no way to leave the EU in any kind of way that the people who wanted Brexit actually wanted without damaging the economy and making working class people even poorer after austerity. But he backed that position because that was the position of those who had power in the Labour Party at the time. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn even literally argued for a hard Brexit.
That we want a tariff-free trade, access to the European market and a partnership with Europe in the future.
But to be absolutely crystal clear, we leave the single European market because we leave the EU.
The two things are inextricably
So we have to leave
linked.
the single market.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's the exact kind of Brexit that we have now. We have a free trade deal, but not membership of the EU single market. And it has taken £1,000 from every household in the country during a cost of living crisis. And when I've called him out on this in the past, he actually tried to lie about me. He said I did absolutely nothing for the Remain cause before the referendum, even though it's a matter of public record. I was in the Irish Times in June 2016 because I bought a t-shirt from Primark, wrote EU questions just asked, and stood in the centre of Birmingham Bullring City Centre for hours because I was so desperate to avoid the damage I knew Brexit would do. And I'd been campaigning since February. Just a few months after, he was telling the left to support Brexit, but he wanted to throw dirt at me to cover up the wrong that he'd done. My point is, he's proven that he's happy to support Labour even when they're copying a right-wing Tory agenda that he knows will make people poorer, and yet now he's leaving Labour because they're copying a right-wing Tory agenda that he knows will make people poorer. So is it about the principle, or is he just making a strategic career decision? And again, he's right, and we do need to work together, but we should have our eyes open as to who we're working with. I'm Femi. Make sure you follow F Politics if politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.